Welcome to our third class in our series on the ACA. As you know, we are on our third session, and we have one more next week. 2 weeks ago, we talked about foundation and we talked about the Affordable Care Act overall. We talked about the exchange and marketplace, the employer mandate, the individual mandate, how they all work together. And also, we talked about market reforms and all the other provisions that come with the Affordable Care Act, not just the employer mandate. But we are focusing mostly on the employer mandate in this series. So last week, we talked about how to navigate the employer mandate in a way that helps you be most compliant. And with that, we talked about the 4 steps that we created, that if you go through intentionally in this order, and follow this process, you will be in a much better position and be more compliant and understand more. So those were our first 2 weeks. This week, we're going to zero in even more on step 4 of the 4 steps that we created on the employer mandate. So like we have done in the past, we're going to review from our session just a little bit from last session. And then we're going to give you an overview of the step 4 measurement methods. That's our 4th step in the 4-step process. Then we'll dive a little bit more into the different measurement methods, the monthly, the initial, and the standard. And then we'll talk about next steps in a process for your newly hired employees. Then, unlike the other sessions, we have some bonus content. We won't be talking about that bonus content, but it's in the slides that you'll receive. And I hope that those slides will help you. And it talks a little bit more about nuanced things and issues and how to resolve those issues. But in addition, we'll talk about those nuances in the last session as well. So that's our agenda for today. So let's move into our quick review from last week. Again, last week, we zeroed in on the employer mandate part of the Affordable Care Act. And we talked about the 4 steps. We talked about determining your size. And if you're small, you're just going to repeat step 1 in that process every year. But if you're large or an applicable large employer, you're going to move on and complete the other steps, including determining your first compliance date. Step 3, determine what will be offered. That's your affordability and minimum value checking. And then the 4th step is determining which employees will be offered coverage and when. In other words, identifying your full-time employees and identifying eligibility timing. So the step 4 of the 4 steps is what we're zeroing in on now. So we started in our first class with kind of high level, and we're kind of zeroing in more and more until we focus on the more nuanced parts of the employer mandate. So as a review on the employer mandate rules, to avoid the penalties on the employer mandate, if you're a large employer, you must offer affordable minimum value coverage to at least 95% of your full-time employees and their dependents. When we talk about all penalties, we're talking about 2 possible penalties, penalty A and penalty B. And penalty A, if you recall, applies when you as a large employer don't offer minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of your full-time employees and their dependents. Penalty B applies if you successfully meet the penalty A threshold, meaning you've offered a plan to at least 95% of your full-time employees, but what you offer isn't affordable or minimum value according to the thresholds that are set in the regulations. So step 4 of our 4-step process directly addresses penalty A. Last week, we talked a little bit about penalty B, and that is addressed in our 3rd step in our 4-step process. So step 3 is affordability and minimum value, and you'll repeat step 3 every year. Step 4, you don't need to repeat every year, but it's really important you complete this step because it helps you avoid even the larger penalty, which is the A penalty. You can, though, adjust or repeat step 4 for a variety of reasons. You might want to change the language and make it more clear, but you also may make some significant changes, like you may change your plan year. If you change your plan year, you're going to need to make changes on your step 4 measurement method policy. And here is a review of the 2 penalties. I get questions on this all the time, so I like to make sure that you have this as easy access. I've got the penalty A highlighted and penalty B a little bit lighter, so you can see that we're focusing on penalty A. And this is how you calculate the actual penalty. If you were to be penalized and it was penalty A were imposed, this is how the IRS would calculate that penalty. And again, it's whatever that amount is. So for example, 2024, the amount, the multiplier is 2,970 multiplied by all your full-time employees minus 30. So the larger employer you are, the more full-time employees you have, the larger potential for a higher penalty. We're going to talk about the words and the definitions in this portion of the employer mandate and the portion that we're talking about with a penalty. And that's the large employer must offer minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of its full-time employees and dependents. Just as a review, again, minimum essential coverage is not minimum value or essential health benefits. Minimum essential coverage means basically if you're offering a group health plan, you are meeting. And you can confirm that if you technically on the summary of benefits and coverage or get that from your carrier or insurer TPA just generally. The other portion of the definition that's important to make sure we're clear on is what full-time employee means and what dependents mean. A dependent is an employee's children up to age 26. And a full-time employee is a worker or an employee that works at least 30 hours per week or an average of 130 hours per month. And that average is usually calculated based on a period of measurement that should not exceed 12 months. And the tip here I want to make sure you understand is you think, well, some people think, well, I know who my full-time employees are. That is not a problem for me. But a lot of times we have employers who have workers who are working more hours than the HR department realizes. And you have employers who are technically working this amount of hours and you're not identifying them and you're not aware of them. So that's why it's important to figure out a way to identify who your full-time employees are. So the key to avoiding the A penalty are three main things. Offer a group health plan, identify all your full-time employees, and identify an accurate eligibility timing process. Let's talk a minute about safe harbors. You have heard me use the word safe harbor before. We used it in step 3 last week when we talked about all 4 steps. But a safe harbor, generally high level, comes about in a situation where regulators in this case are the Internal Revenue or the Treasury. We shorten that by saying IRS. HHS and DOL understand it may be difficult for a company or an employer to make sure or fully confirm that they are complying with the law. A lot of times there's some ambiguity. It's not clear. So in response to that, sometimes regulators will create what's called a safe harbor. A safe harbor is a method that if you follow, that will keep you safe from penalty, meaning if you follow this safe path, you'll ensure that you're going to meet the criteria that are set out in the rule. So we have 2 safe harbors actually within the employer mandate. Step 3, like we talked about last week, has the affordability safe harbor. Remember, we had 3 options, the FPL method, the W-2 method, and the rate of pay method. Safe harbor there. We also have a safe harbor for step 4, which is called the look back measurement method safe harbor. Now that is a mouthful, and I will most often just be referring to it as the measurement methods, but technically it's called the look back measurement method safe harbor. So let's dive in now that we have that review a little bit more. We've got 2 slides with a preview before we actually talk about the rule itself. There's a pro about this safe harbor and a con about this safe harbor. The pro is that it's incredibly helpful and valuable. It really is. And I want you to look at this process and the safe harbor, if you can, as a positive thing, because it provides a clear guidance, it provides consistency, it precisely identifies employees who are meeting full-time or not, and it precisely identifies eligibility dates. The con is, for those of you who are new to this, those of you who have been around this understand this already, is that there is a significant learning curve with this safe harbor, meaning it can be confusing and complex at first. And so when you're learning this, it can be a little bit frustrating. But once you get over that learning curve, it really can be quite helpful. So here's my therapy portion of our presentation today is be patient with yourself. It's okay to feel frustrated. This is totally normal if this is new to you. Even if it's not new to you and you still haven't wrapped your head around this process yet, That is totally normal. It's great that you're here and that you're learning this. And so that's a plus. And we have created some tools to help you with this by helping you figure out how to create your own measurement method policy that you can refer to every time you have questions. You'll want to get familiar and comfortable with your written measurement method policy once you create this, when you go through the steps. You're also going to want to review the resources in that 4-step packet or toolkit. You can listen to the recordings on all of these different sessions. The 2 last sessions will be specifically on the measurement methods, this one and next week. I want you to know that you can ask questions as much as you need until you get familiar with it and comfortable with it. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable to ask questions because you feel like, oh, I should know this. I'm embarrassed to ask this question. And honestly, I think it's really smart to ask questions up front when you're learning it. And then you know you have a solid base and you know how to understand this correctly rather than kind of being unsure for a long time. Again, here's our written measurement method policy kind of hype up for completing this step 4. This template that we'll give you in step 4 has almost every word in it, every provision in it that you need. It's already there for you, but you will need to make some decisions on what to put in certain locations. It's a long template, and that immediately when you open that up, you think, oh, this is long, this is overwhelming, but it really is. Most of the words are already there for you. You just need to make a few decisions. I strongly suggest, if you haven't put one of these together yet, that you open up our FAQ that's in that toolkit too on one screen and have the template on the other screen. And if you do that in order, the FAQs are placed in an order that should help you as you walk through the template. And again, we have those additional tools for you. And you can always contact us. We're here to help. So ask your questions and let's make sure you're figuring this out in the correct way. Okay, we are ready to dive into the actual measurement method. And again, technically it's the look back measurement method safe harbor, but we'll probably just mostly, because it's a mouthful, just say measurement methods. The basics of this are that the purpose is to accurately help you identify your full-time employees, those who should be offered coverage, and to help you accurately identify when somebody needs to go on coverage and somebody loses eligibility. So eligibility questions are precisely answered with this policy. If you don't have this policy and you have a question about it and you say, hey, Susan, I need to know what to do with this employee. They changed their hours. I don't know what to do. I can't help you with an exact answer. I can tell you the general rules, but I can't help you with an exact answer unless I have your measurement method policy here and we take the facts for this particular employee and we run it through your policy, because the answer will be different depending on some different factors with each individual employee, the timing and everything. So the method is based on tracking, measuring, and averaging hours of service. It's not just hours, it's hours of service. And what does that mean? Hours of service includes hours actually worked. Common question, does that mean overtime hours as well? Yes. Any hours actually worked, you're counting this. But it's also any hours that an employee is paid or entitled to payment even when no work is performed. And sometimes we have employers who get caught up in this as well. So that includes things like annual leave, FMLA, jury duty, military duty. They get credit for those hours. So we call it hours of service rather than hours worked. When we talked about this up here on the thing, it says most common length of time to track and measure is 12 months. So this is a super basic kind of Excel spreadsheet example. So you understand what we're talking about tracking. We created this back in the beginning to help people understand what we mean by tracking hours of service. It's here, if you look at it really quickly, you put in the employee name, their hire date, and then you plug in. This is just one example of a standard measurement period. It would be different for some people depending on when your plan year starts, but you can see that you've got 12 months of the year, December, January, February through November. And you're just simply plugging in hours of service for that month. And then you're totaling those hours of service up after the 12 months and dividing by 12, because, right, we're averaging all these hours to give an average monthly hours of service. Again, you put in for that particular employee, all the hours worked or hours of credit, hours of service, not just hours worked, but hours of service. And at the end of those 12 months, you're going to add up all those hours and divide by 12 because there's 12 months. So that's your average. And then you come up with a total average monthly hourly number. And in this case, in this example, if you look on this last column, there isn't anybody whose average hours were 130 or more, but a full-time employee would be someone who has in that last column at least 130 hours of service. So the measurement methods have three main parts for tracking, measuring, and averaging. There's the permanent standard look-back measurement method. Then there are two temporary methods. The temporary methods are the monthly measurement method, and that's used for your newly hired employees who at the time of hire are expected to be full-time, and a temporary initial look-back measurement method, very similar to the standard, but has some differences. And that's used for your newly hired employers who at the time of hire are not expected to work full-time. So again, you've got your permanent method, which is your standard, and two temporary methods. Where you live, the heart of this whole process, the core of it is the standard measurement method. And everyone, meaning your newly hired employees, are going to be funneled or transitioned into the standard method as well, but you need a temporary method as well. I'm a huge fan of visuals. I learn visually, I learn with pictures, and hopefully for those of you who learn this way, these diagrams that I have are helpful as well. This chart shows you the three main basic measurement methods. You've got your newly hired employees that are expected to be full-time, your newly hired employees who are not expected to be full-time. That includes your part-time employees, your variable hour employees, your full-time seasonal employees, but they're seasonal, so they can go in this category. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then your ongoing employees. If you want to talk about the heart of this method, it's there in the corner in the gray with the blue, the standard look-back measurement method. That's where everybody's going to end up, right? But in the Navy category, the newly hired employees reasonably expected to be full-time, they're temporarily going to have hours tracked in the monthly measurement method before they are transitioned fully into the standard look-back measurement method. Those who are not expected to be full-time are temporarily going to have hours of service tracked in the initial look-back measurement method, and then eventually be transitioned into the standard. So hopefully this visual helps. I know it helps me. Let's talk now specifically about each one of these methods as an overview, and then we'll kind of dive deep into more and more of the nuances. So the high-level summary of the standard look-back measurement method is that it applies to all employees. It applies to your ongoing employees. Those are your employees who are not newly hired. And it also applies to your newly hired employees. So this is your stable, consistent, permanent method. This method continually repeats each year on the same dates. Now, you have technically the ability to choose the period of time you have for each of these three parts of this standard measurement method. You've got the standard measurement period, your standard administrative period, and your standard stability period. I have here in parentheses because for a while, when the rules first came out, some companies were playing around with different periods of time you should measure. But I will tell you, 99% of people or companies are using, and for good reasons, 12 months, 2 months, and 12 months. So you're going to measure for 12 months. You're going to have an administrative period for 2 months, and then have your standard stability period as 12 months. You're going to want to align the dates of when this starts every year on the same day with your plan and your timing. So your stability period dates should align with your plan year. So for example, if your plan year starts every January, you want your stability period to start every January. If your plan year starts every June, you want your stability period to start every June. You also want to align your administrative period date so that your open enrollment can happen during your administrative period. So again, more visuals. Here's the basic structure for the standard measurement method. We've got first the measurement period of 12 months, next the administrative period of 2 months, and this happens immediately after, and next the stability period of 12 months. Here's an example of aligning the measurement methods to your calendar year plan. Again, if you don't have a calendar year plan, meaning your plan does not start on January of every year, this would look a little bit different. But because we have a lot of plans that start every January, I've selected that one. So if you look at the very bottom, your standard stability period or plan year, that says January 1st, 2025. But you're going to be dealing with determining eligibility for that plan starting with November 1st of 2023. That's why it's called the look back. You're looking back at hours of service tracked during a 12-month period. It's actually 26 months prior. So November 1st, you're going to start of 2023 and end October 31st of 2024. That's your tracking period. Then you're going to have an administrative period, which is the time you also want to align with your open enrollment, which is 2 months, November 1st, 2024 through December 31st, 2024. And then for the plan year that starts January 1, that will go from January through the end of the year. And like I said, this cycle repeats every year. There's no month in which there's not some tracking happening. So when your measurement period ended in November for a calendar year plan again, started November 1st, 2019 and ended October 31st, 2020, the next cycle immediately starts. So if you look at that next line with the light blue, the next measurement period automatically starts again November 1st, 2020. And then if we were to have a third cycle, the third measurement period would start November 1st, 2021. Same thing happens with your stability period. Your stability period started January 1, 2021, went through the end of the year, immediately started again January 1st, 2022, and so on. Just to really bring this message home, I've got another way of showing the cycles here. It's with columns rather than horizontal. We've got 3 cycles this time, and you can see if you look at that first cycle down at the bottom, let's say, for example, this employer, the first time that they were considered large is in 2024. They have a calendar year plan. So their first standard stability period 1 would start on January 1st, 2024. I'm looking at the very bottom of that first standard look back cycle. But you're going to base eligibility for that plan on hours of service tracked between November 1st, 2022 through October 31st, 2023. And again, you can see how this repeats. Your measurement period in the second standard cycle starts November 1st, 2023, and the third cycle starts November 1st, 2024, and so on. So again, there's tracking that is always happening every month. There's not a period of time when you're not tracking hours of service. Some more tracking rules for the standard look back measurement method. During the measurement period, you're going to be tracking hours of service, right? During the administrative period, you're going to be doing a bunch of things. Administrative things. That's the reason for the name, the administrative period. So you're going to add all the hours of service tracked during that 12 months. And that's why I showed you that Excel spreadsheet before. Now, I don't know if you're going to need an Excel spreadsheet. You might have a payroll vendor or other platform that helps you calculate those hours, but you're going to need to collect all those hours for that period, add them all up and divide by 12 to get your hours of service count. For each employee whose average monthly is 130 hours or more, they are eligible for the next group health plan, the plan that starts in the next couple of months. If they are eligible, you're going to want to communicate to them during this period of time, this administrative period, that they are in fact eligible, so they can decide whether they want to enroll or not. Your job is to offer to your full-time employees. It is up to them whether they want to enroll or not. It doesn't affect any penalties on you if they don't enroll. Your goal is to offer to them. And again, you want to align this administrative period so that your open enrollment can happen during the administrative period. So you're doing the math, figuring who's eligible, communicating, having your open enrollment, getting all your papers and your plan all ready to go. Then your stability period is your actual plan year, right? And that's 12 months, and it starts on day 1. So eligibility starts day 1 of that. If an employee has earned it in the measurement period, they are locked in, for lack of a better word, to eligibility for the full plan year. So that's the general rule. There are some exceptions. We won't talk about those exceptions today. That will be a little bit more next week. Generally, if that's the world you live in, is they earned it, they're locked in, even if their hours go down. Now, those hours have gone down during that stability period, remember, are also being tracked in a new cycle of a new measurement period. So it will affect eligibility possibly for the next plan year, but it doesn't for the year in which they earned it. I hope that this is okay for you, for those of you who know this rule inside and out, but there will be a lot of repetition. And I've learned over the years that it's important to have repetition to help you learn this. And hopefully it won't drive you crazy to hear these things repeated. But I've learned that it's important to do this. So who do we apply the standard method to? We are applying the standard measurement method to all employees. Again, it's to ongoing employees who are just have been with you for a while, but it's also to your newly hired employees. All newly hired employees are transitioned into the standard measurement method cycle. This includes those who are expected to be full-time when they're hired and those who are not expected to be full-time when they're hired. You are tracking everyone. Things can change and you don't know. You're going to start tracking hours of service at the first standard measurement period that occurs after they're hired. That might not be immediate. So what about the gap of time between the new employee hire date and the time the first standard measurement period starts? Again, you're not going to make up a date. Your standard happens the same month every year, and you're going to start tracking them in that first month. But there is a gap a lot of times, almost every time, between when they first start and the start of the first standard measurement period. For example, a new employee starts on March 12th, but the next standard measurement period does not start until November 1st. Is there any tracking between March and November? We're going to answer that question, but have I answered that question? We've got a question. Yeah. If you have employees who are locked into eligibility, no matter how many hours they work, technically you should be tracking everyone's hours of service because things change and you have that record. But in practicality, if you have employees that are for sure never going to lose eligibility, you don't practically need to track them. But technically, yes. Practically, no. Does that make sense? Okay. No, if it's not clear, I want to answer. Okay. Hopefully you have a system that if something happens and something changes and there's a question, you know what their hours are. I think it's cleaner if you just continue to track everybody because you never know what's going to happen in the future. But practically speaking, I know that some people don't. Yes. Okay. So the question is, what do we do? What's the definition of hours of service, or what is included specifically in hours of service? Because when we were on that other page, should we go back? No, we won't go back. It includes hours for which they're actually paid. So if it's FMLA that's paid, it's counted. If it's vacation that's paid, it counts. There are special unpaid rules, and that includes unpaid FMLA, unpaid jury duty, and unpaid military duty. That is all laid out in your measurement method template, and it has the definitions. It's got a whole section on paid leave and unpaid leave and special unpaid leave. There's special unpaid leave. That's protected leave, right? It's protected because it's FMLA or because it's jury duty or military, but then there's regular unpaid leave. That does not count. If they just go and they're on regular unpaid leave, you do not count those hours of service. And there's a whole process that's in our bonus slides that talks about what to do when someone leaves on regular unpaid leave and then comes back. Do we credit them or not? And it's in bonus slides right now because I have learned that we need to do the basics today before we get into even the nuances. So basics today, which won't feel like basics to some of you, but there's even more nuance. So thank you for asking. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes. Workers' comp, I am not an expert on. And so I'm trying to remember, but they're paid, right? I believe it is as well, but because it's not fresh on my mind, I want to confirm, but I would say yes now that you would include that because it's protected. So thank you for your opinions as well. Okay. So getting back to the slides, what about the gap of time between a new employee hire date and the first standard measurement period? How do we deal with that? Because you're not going to start your standard any other time than your same month every single year. That's where you live. That's your normal cycle. That's consistent. Regulators came up with two temporary methods. We have temporary methods that help with that gap of time between the date of hire and the first standard measurement period that occurs after hire. You're going to use that temporary measurement method until the employee is fully transitioned into the standard. You drop the temporary method and you just are able to continue that cycle with that employee. You're going to use a temporary method and the standard method at the same time. You don't want to forget that you're also tracking with the permanent measurement method as well. So this means there will be two separate measurement methods being tracked at the same time. So the temporary method will be running as well as a separate method, which is the standard. So each method should be addressed and treated separately. So what is the timing for the temporary measurement methods versus the standard measurement method? temporary measurement method starts immediately after they start working. That's when you're tracking. Temporary method is immediately after they start working. The standard again starts at the first standard measurement period after hire. The temporary measurement method stops when the employee is fully transitioned, like we said, into the standard. The employee is fully transitioned into the standard at the end of the first standard measurement period after hire. So you're going to start tracking their hours at the first standard measurement period that starts after hire. And at the end of that measurement period, they are fully transitioned and you can call them an ongoing employee. So I'm going to say that again just to make that stick. You are going to start the standard measurement period at the first standard measurement period that occurs after hire, and they'll be fully transitioned into an ongoing employee on the last day of that first standard measurement. And you're going to drop the temporary method. So what are the two temporary measurement methods? We talked about them before, but we're going to repeat a lot of stuff. So it hopefully helps. The monthly measurement method and the initial look back measurement method. The monthly measurement method is a temporary method used for newly hired employees who at the time of hire are expected to be full-time. The initial look back measurement method is used for all other newly hired employees. That's those who are not expected to be full-time at the time of hire. That includes employees who are you expect to be part-time, you expect to be variable. Variable means, well, we know that they're going to work full-time sometimes and part-time sometimes. We don't know exactly. That's hard to identify. Those are variable hour employees. Also, you have the option of including full-time seasonal employees. Full-time seasonal employees are those employees who fit a specific definition. So you can't just decide, oh, they're seasonal because we're just hiring them for a minute. They have to be an employee who's in a position which the customary annual employment is 6 months or less. That is seasonal. Remember, we also talked about seasonal and step one when you're calculating your size. That's a different definition, not to make things confusing, but that's a different definition. So forget about that. We are now talking about the definition of full-time for step 4. And step 4 says the employee in a position for which the customary annual employment is 6 months or less. And customary, what's the definition of customary? Customary means an employee who typically works each calendar year in approximately the same time of the year, such as summer or winter. That's your seasonal employees. So you might be people who work on the golf course, during the summer, or it might be, although that might be too long of a period, so they might not be seasonal, or at ski resorts or at Christmas time and so on. So that is kind of the overview. So now we're going to kind of narrow in a little bit more and talk a little bit more about each of these temporary methods. First, it will be the monthly measurement method. The monthly measurement method is a temporary method that is used for your newly hired employees who at the time of hire are expected to be full-time. This method starts immediately when they're hired. You're going to offer to these employees because they're eligible right up front. They're full-time, so they're eligible, and you're going to have a new hire waiting period. So you're going to make sure that their coverage starts within your new hire waiting period, whatever that is. And you're going to continue that monthly measurement method until the employee is transitioned into the permanent standard measurement cycle measurement method. And when does that happen, right? And a newly hired employee becomes an ongoing employee at the end, the last day of the first standard measurement period. So again, you're going to start tracking them immediately in the monthly measurement method at hire. And then at the first standard measurement period that starts after hire, you're going to start tracking them on that one as well. So 2 separate, completely independent methods. And you're going to drop the monthly measurement method on the last day of the first standard measurement period. So the tracking rules are, you're not going to be averaging. Monthly measurement method, there's no averaging hours over a period of time. It's simply a month-to-month cycle, and it's not intended for permanent use. I've had some employers say, well, can't we just use the monthly measurement method for everything and make things simpler? The monthly measurement method was never intended to be permanent. We don't have a ton of regulations on it and a lot of clarity. We just know that it's month to month and it's supposed to be dropped off. And so if an employee has 130 hours or more hours of service or in a particular month, they are eligible for that month. And honestly, if you're hiring somebody who at the time of hire is expected to be full-time, they are going to be meeting those hours, and you don't need to worry about it. I do get some questions sometimes because somebody hires somebody full-time and then something changes. So you're going to be dealing with that. But generally, this is just month to month. So here is my visual for this to help you understand. Hopefully it helps. It's pretty basic, but the monthly measurement period, if they're hired in August, if they worked in August 2024, 130 hours or more, they're eligible for that month. If they worked in 130 hours or more in September 2024, they're eligible for that month. If they worked 130 hours or more in October 2024, they're eligible for that month. You get the point, right? It's simply month to month. I've got an example of a monthly measurement method eligibility policy here. This is taken directly from the template, the written measurement method template that we will give you in step 4. And it basically deals with a situation, the rare situation where you might have somebody you've hired as full-time and for whatever reason their hours have gone down. Do I take them off coverage immediately? Do I not? What happens? This is your rule. If you have somebody who's still considered newly hired and they're in this category of tracking, you're going to go to this rule and say, this is how I identify whether they drop off coverage or not. So if an employee continues to have at least 130 hours of service within each month, the employee remains eligible. If an employee has fewer than 130 hours of service per month for 3 consecutive calendar months, and that's something you will choose. I talked about how you will fill in the template and make some decisions. You will choose whether that's 3 consecutive calendar months or 2 consecutive calendar months or 4 consecutive calendar months. I recommend generally doing 3 because it's kind of consistent and parallel with the rules, other rules generally, and it helps you kind of keep track of if you have 3 months in your mind for something else. Let's talk about 3 months here too. But if they have 3 consecutive months of under 130 hours, then they lose eligibility the first of the next month. Same thing applies if they lose it, but then they start working 130 hours a month, 3 consecutive months in a row, they gain it back. And you use this method until when? Until the standard. Is it until the beginning of the first standard measurement period or until the end of the first standard measurement period? Here we go. Let's talk about the initial measurement method. Okay, this is the other temporary method. Yes. The question is, how do we deal with employees? If this is all a tracking hours of service system, how are we supposed to deal with employees for whom we don't track hours? And in most cases, those are people who are salaried, who are considered to be full-time. And so the practical way to approach this is to say, hey, we know that they're full-time. We're going to credit them full-time hours. So simple. Yeah, assume it. Okay, so the second temporary measurement method is the initial measurement method, and that is used for newly hired employees who at the time of hire are not expected to be full-time. So this is a category of employees, anybody who doesn't fall into the expected to be full-time category. The timing of this, and they're not eligible up front, right? Because they're not full-time. So you're going to spend some time tracking hours of service up front before they are considered eligible. And that tracking, according to the regulators, can be as long as 12 months. So you can hire a newly hired employee who's not expected to be full-time and not worry about offering them coverage if they happen to increase their hours or whatever until you have tracked their hours for 12 months. And here are the basic rules. Very similar to the standard, but a little bit different. You're going to have an initial administrative period, part 1, which is from the date of hire through the end of that month. That's just basically a practical method to get you starting things at the beginning of a month. And then you're going to start your measurement period, 12 months, your administrative period, part 2. This specifically cannot be more than 1 month, because the regulations specifically say you can't make them wait more than 12 months plus another administrative period. So you've got the 1 month plus the partial month that's allowed, and that's it. So no 2-month administrative period here. And then you have your stability period, which is 12 months. We haven't talked about this, but the measurement period and the stability period should line up to be the same period of time. So you're going to continue this temporary initial measurement method until the employee is transitioned fully into this standard, the permanent method. The full transition to a standard is at the end of the first standard measurement period after hire, right? They're considered a newly hired employee after that point. I mean, an ongoing employee after that point. Here's a summary of the tracking rules for initial. Very similar, like I said, to the standard, but a little bit different. But the overall skeleton of this is the same. You're going to be tracking their hours of service, and during the administrative period, which in this case is part 2 administrative period, you're going to be doing the same thing you do in the standard. You're going to add up all their hours of service, track during the initial measurement period, and average over that initial measurement period. Assuming it's 12 months, you're going to divide by 12 to get a monthly hours of service count. If monthly average hours is 130 hours or more, then the employee is eligible for the group health plan. And this happens fairly often for some employers. Some employers hire legitimately employees who they don't expect to be full-time, but for whatever reason, there's not a communication between HR and the manager is allowing these people to work more hours than intended. And so you've identified somebody who is actually full-time. If they do average 130 hours or more, they are eligible, and you're going to want to communicate that eligibility to them. And remember, this is not during open enrollment. This is their own administrative period. So it could happen anytime throughout the year. You're going to need to make sure you tell them, hey, by the way, you are actually eligible. We'll look at eligibility again after the standard cycle, but you are eligible now under the initial. Again, if they're eligible, coverage begins day 1 of the initial stability period and continues for the full period, regardless of current hours of service worked, meaning they're locked in. If they earned it in the measurement period, they are locked into eligibility during the standard. The stability period here, I just want to make a point, does not align with the plan year again. This is going to be their own individual customized cycle that runs. And here's a diagram or a visual that helps. The basic structure. You've got your administrative period part 1, and you've got your administrative period part 2. This, and at the beginning when I was learning this, I thought this just complicates things even more, but actually it doesn't. It actually makes things simpler because you're just able to then start your initial measurement period at the first of a month rather than in the middle of the month, and then it gets really confusing. So it's just bringing you administrative period part 1 brings you to the end of the month so that you can start your initial measurement period, the beginning of a new month. Then you have your 1 month administrative period and your initial stability period. So here's an example of an employee that was hired on March 12th of 2024. The initial administrative period part A goes from March 12th, the day they start working, through the end of the month. The initial measurement period starts April 1st, it goes for 12 months. The initial administrative period part B starts April 1st and ends at the end of that month. And the initial stability period starts May 1st for 12 months. This individual may be eligible 13 and a half months into hire, not at a time when open enrollment starts. They need to be offered coverage at that time. They may or may not opt in. That's not a problem for you. It doesn't matter whether they opt in or not. You want to be able to show that you offered that coverage. Yes, you would talk to them about it during April and ask them if they want to enroll or not, give them all the materials, and it would be effective May 1. The question is, when exactly does it start? When are they actually eligible? When is the coverage actually effective? And it is May 1. So the initial stability period date is always represents the first day of actual coverage. So stability period is actual coverage period. So we talked a little bit more about the general rules about the monthly measurement method and the initial measurement method, both temporary methods. Now we're going to go in a little bit deeper and talk about how this overlaps with the standard and explain really practically from a practical perspective what that looks like. But again, I want to show you this visual. Hopefully this helps to help you kind of clarify in your mind. I love context, and this kind of big context helps me. You've got your 3 categories of employees. Those are your 3 buckets. That's the world you live in. You've got your newly hired employees who are reasonably expected to be full-time. You've got your newly hired employees who are not expected to be full-time, and you've got your ongoing employees. The heart of the whole process is down in the right-hand corner, standard look-back measurement method. That's where we live. That's our main cycle. That runs consistent with our plan year. That's where we want everybody in. But we have a period of time with newly hired employees where they're going to be transitioned in. And because you don't hire all of your newly hired employees on the first day of the standard measurement period, you've got to do a temporary method for these other employees, because every month that they start work every day from, let me say, there should be tracking happening for all employees every day, newly hired and ongoing. And that's why we have this temporary tracking for newly hired as well. So let's understand the tracking overlap. The temporary measurement methods for newly hired employees and the permanent standard measurement method overlap for a period of time. And this is where people get a little bit confused. You need to consider these as completely separate methods. They're just running parallel to each other, and you need to address each one separately. So the monthly measurement method and the standard measurement method will overlap some but not all of the same periods, the same months. And the initial measurement method and the standard measurement method will as well overlap with some but not all of the same months. Even though they overlap, doesn't mean you shouldn't be treating them as two separate tracking cycles. So here are the rules. Each method should be treated as two separate and distinct eligibility calculations. It is possible to be eligible under one method and not under the other method. So just because somebody's not eligible under one method doesn't mean that they're not eligible on the other. They are two separate, completely different eligibility calculations. So for example, a newly hired employee not expected to be full-time may not have, after the end of the measurement period, 130 hours or more under the initial measurement period, but may end up with 130 hours or more under the standard. So they wouldn't be offered under the initial, but they would be offered under the standard, or vice versa. You could have a newly hired employee not expected to be full-time, and they actually have tracked 130 hours of service or more during the initial. You need to offer them coverage. But then under the standard cycle, they're not, for whatever reason. They weren't supposed to be, and the manager, you communicate with the manager, and the hours are controlled a little bit more, then they wouldn't be eligible under the standard. But you still need to let the whole initial cycle work all the way through, and the whole 12-month stability period. So before we talk and do visuals of the overlap, we're going to review the rules again. So we're going to do some visuals so you can help see how these two kind of overlap with each other. But again, we're just going to, not to insult anybody's intelligence, but I've learned that just repeating this is helpful. A review of the standard measurement method works like this. You're going to have a 12-month tracking hours of service period. You're going to have a 2-month administrative period. That's where you do adding up all the hours, offering coverage if applicable, and a 12-month stability period where they are eligible for the full 12 months. You're using this method for all your ongoing employees and all your newly hired employees. And the process repeats and starts at the same time of year every year. Again, here's a visual of the standard measurement method. And here is a review of the monthly. Again, the monthly measurement method applies to newly hired employees who are expected at the time of hire to be full-time. The timing of this is a little bit different. You start tracking under the monthly method immediately after hire. You're going to offer the group health plan within your new hire waiting period because they're eligible up front. In addition, you're going to start the permanent standard measurement method at the first standard measurement period after hire, and you're going to continue the temporary monthly method until the employee is fully transitioned into the permanent standard method. And that happens at the end of the first standard measurement period. Again, the method is no averaging of hours over 12 months. There's no averaging anything. It's just adding up hours in a month. If they worked 130 hours or more, they're eligible that month. This is a month-by-month method. And here is, again, the visual that talks about the monthly measurement method. Each individual month is its own eligibility period. If they worked it, they are eligible for that period. And then I gave you the sample language of what it will look like in your written measurement method policy. If for some reason you hire somebody who you expect to be full-time and they end up not being, you're going to use this method to determine eligibility. But you will stop using this method to determine eligibility at the end of the first standard measurement period after hire. At that point, then you're going to use the standard method to determine eligibility, which is a completely different method. So here's the overlap. Let's say this employee was hired in August of 2024, so this month. And let's say you have a calendar year plan. So your standard measurement period starts every month of November. So November 1st, your standard starts. They start, however, on August of 2024. So you're immediately going to start the monthly measurement period. August, the only measurement period that's tracking right now for August, September, and October is the monthly measurement method. Then in November, you start a second method, right? You're going to continue the monthly measurement method all the way through until October of 2025, right? Because why October 2025? Right, because October 31st, 2025 is the end of the first standard that starts after hire. So if you look at that navy box, standard measurement period starts November 1st, 2024 and ends October 31st, 2025. On October 31st, 2025, you drop the monthly measurement method and they are fully transitioned into the standard, and you're just going to repeat. You see, I've got 3 different standard measurement periods. It's period 1. The next period starts November 1st, 2025. The next one starts November 1st, 2026, and so on. If the diagram were perfect, we wouldn't have them underneath each other. They would be off to the angle, but we don't have room for that on the slide. So you have to forgive like the exact, it's not an exact spacing here, but that's how it works. Do we have any questions? Yes. So the question is, this was a 15-month cycle for this employee. This employee was on the monthly measurement method for 15 months. It could be different for if an employee was hired in March, then it would be a longer period of monthly, right? So it's different for everybody. But the question is, for this period between August 2024 and October 2025, the eligibility rule that you're dealing with is if they is monthly. So if they don't work for 3 months in a row, at least 130 hours, they would lose eligibility. And if they work 130 hours 3 months after that, over 130 hours, they would get it back. Is that your question? And honestly, I don't think the regulators anticipated that happening. The whole point of this is just to set up a standard. So, because I think in their minds, it's you've hired somebody who's expected to be full-time, they'll be full-time and there's no issues. But in real life, sometimes issues come up. But for most of your employees who are hired as full-time, you won't have to deal with that. They'll just be tracked and they'll be full-time and you're fine. So, but you want some solutions if they don't, and you want to do it correctly. And you don't want to take them off early. And we have some employers that say, oh, they're not working, we're going to take them off immediately. Do not take them off immediately. You need to make sure you're following your policy and make sure you're putting them on as well. So that's how the monthly measurement method, the temporary method, overlaps with the standard. So now we're going to talk about how the initial measurement method overlaps with the standard. So a little quick review here. There are 2 types of look-back measurement methods. They're technically the standard, and then there's also the initial. You've noticed that they're very similar because they have the same basic tracking rules. The standard is used permanently, right, for everybody, and it's used to transition newly hired employees as well. And the initial is used only temporarily for those who are newly hired and expected not to be full-time. So both the standard and the initial methods look back. So I've got here that shows you the rules during the measurement period. This is exactly the same. You're tracking hours of service. During the administrative period, you're adding up the hours, figuring out who's eligible, communicating that, and getting them on coverage. And during the standard initial stability period, they are eligible and they're locked in during that period, regardless of hours worked currently. And here's a review of the standard again. It's just the same thing, 12 months, 2 months, 12 months. And again, this process repeats and starts. And here's the slide that shows you how this works for the standard and how it works as the continuously repeat. It just, when one ends, the next one starts. And the initial is the same. You've got your administrative period, part A, though, at the very beginning. So your administrative period is split. That's the difference there. And the other difference is that it stops. It isn't permanent, but you have the similarity where you've got the 12 months of measurement, the 1 month versus 2 months on the administrative period, and then the 12 months. Okay, and here's again the basic structure for the initial. So here's the overlap. Let's say this employee was hired in March of 2024. So the initial administrative period, part 1, would start immediately and it would go through the end of the month. So they start March 12th, you start tracking on the initial measurement method immediately. On April 1st, you would start tracking your 12-month initial measurement period. Then on April 1st, the month in 2025, you would do your administrative period, and your initial stability period runs from May 2025 through April of 2025. Sorry, 2026. Sorry, there's a typo there. That is not good. So we'll fix that before the slides go out. So when do you drop the standard measurement period? Sorry, the initial, at the end of the full cycle. They technically become an ongoing employee at the end of the first standard measurement period after hire, which would be October 31st. That's the same of 2025 because they were hired in March. You start the standard measurement period on November 1st of 2024. This assumes that this employer has a calendar year plan. We're doing that for simplicity, but you may have a different cycle, right? Depending on where you are on that. But they become a ongoing employee at the end of that first cycle, but you're going to continue that initial cycle all the way through. And if they're eligible for coverage under the initial stability period, that you need to make sure that they are offered that for the full 12 months. If they become eligible for the standard stability period, you need to make sure that they're eligible for that as well. We're going to move on. This is the measurement method process for newly hired employees. This is just kind of a repeat again to help you kind of walk through what your list is if you have a newly hired employee. So it's a review, but hopefully this way of laying it out helps as well. So we're trying a bunch of different ways to help it make sense. When you hire somebody, you have a newly hired employee, your step one is, and this is different steps. We're not talking about the 4 steps for employer shared responsibility. We're just talking about your steps, how to deal with your newly hired employee. You're going to determine whether a newly hired employee is at that time of hire reasonably expected to be full-time. Your next step is, once you know that, if they're not reasonably expected to be full-time, you've got to identify what tracking method. If they're not expected to be full-time, they would be tracked in the initial. If they are expected to be full-time, they'd be tracked in the monthly. Temporarily, right? And then step 3 is at the beginning of the next standard measurement period after hire, you're also going to be tracking under that method as well. Let's talk about step 1 really quickly and possible issues that come up with identifying whether an employee is expected to be full-time. These are some common questions that have come up, so we're going to address that. And it's really the only step that we have these kind of questions. So what if it is not clear whether at the time of hire an employee will be full-time? For some people, some employers might be saying, oh, well, how can it not be clear? We know whether it's clear or not, but there are some employers for whom it is not clear. So the practical questions to ask and what are in the regulations is to ask questions like, is the new employee replacing a full-time or part-time employee? That can give you a clue. Do employees in comparable positions work full-time or part-time? Was a position advertised as full-time or part-time? Did you describe this position as full-time or part-time? What does the employment contract, if there is one, say? So those are some practical questions to ask, but if it still isn't clear, this is the next most common question that I get on this. What about temporary, short-term, or project employees? Susan, we've got somebody that we're hiring and they are going to work full-time, there's no question, but they are not going to be with us indefinitely. This is a project, or it's temporary, or it's short-term, whatever it is you call it. What is the rule? The regulations specifically address this question, and they say that you should determine this employee to be reasonably expected to be full-time, and you should not take into account that they may be leaving you as your employment sooner than later. If you have any of these employees, you are not going to put them in the other category and track them and wait for 13 and a half months before you determine eligibility. You are going to offer them coverage up front, and then they will lose it, obviously, when they leave, if they opt in. What about full-time seasonal employees? This is the next most common question. And we talked about this already, but let's repeat it again. If you hire somebody and they are expected to be full-time, you would normally put them in that monthly measurement method, technically offer them coverage, and then transition them into the standard. However, there is an exception for full-time seasonal employees. If you have employees that are legitimately, and I emphasize legitimately, seasonal workers, even though they're going to be full-time, you are allowed to put them in that other category into the initial and track their hours for 12 months, do an administrative period for another month and a partial month before you determine whether they're eligible or not. Okay, then we have the next one step, which is super easy. Once you identify whether they're full-time, you know whether they go on the monthly tracking or the initial. Monthly, again, is for those who are expected to be full-time, initial for everybody else who are not. And then you are going to remember to start also a separate measurement method with the standard so that they can slowly be transitioned into the core of your whole question, your whole process. So we are 12 minutes after. We're supposed to end at 15 minutes after. I want to take questions here, but I also want to show you some of our bonus slides. I have in past talked about some of these issues after we talked about all of this, but I feel like this is plenty to take in as it is. If it's a review, it's great. If it's new, it's a lot to take in. Here's our bonus content. First of all, these are just easy peasy checklists, employer stats for newly hired employees. If you want to pull this out and this kind of walks you through, each task, determine whether newly hired employees expected to be full-time. If reasonably expected to be full-time, then complete the rest of the tasks. This one is if you identify they're not reasonably expected to be full-time, here's your tasks. So that's an easy kind of template to follow. And then we have a section of bonus slides that deals with measurement methods and the return from unpaid leave, like we talked about for a minute, and how to deal with that. There's a special rules that you're allowed to use, and you will need to, in your measurement method policy, need to decide whether you're going to use one rule or the other. But it's an important question. Are rehires or employees returning from unpaid leave treated as an ongoing employee or as a newly hired employee? That's really important because if they're ongoing, they get credit for hours worked before they left. If they're considered a newly hired employee, they don't get credit for any of the hours that they worked before they left. You will start fresh. So that's an important thing to decide. And then our last bonus slide section is another kind of issues and complications that come up. And what if there is a change of status? I know, Susan, that you said that if you are earn it in the measurement period, you are locked into eligibility for the full stability period, even if hours go down. And that is in fact the rule, but there are some limited exceptions to that and nuances that we will talk about on another day. But if you want to go to it now, we've got the explanation here. That is the end of our class for today. And I want to take any questions if you have any. Yes. On workers' comp, I'm going to double check that. Okay, so tell me what you found. You found the rule? Oh, okay. Say it again for me. Sorry, I missed it. So does it say workers' comp hours do count? They do not count. Unless it's also FMLA. There you go. And I will add something maybe to the slides so that that's clear. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I haven't thought about that for a long time, so I can't remember off the top of my head. Anybody else? Yes. The question is, how would you classify an intern? That is just so nuanced. You're going to hate my answer. It depends. Interns generally no, because they would be put in the general category as if we're hiring them as full-time, but we know they're going to be short-term. So you would offer them coverage up front if they're going to work full-time. However, there are some employers who feel comfortable with making the argument that they fall into a full-time seasonal employee. And if you feel comfortable with that, I think there's a reasonable argument to be made for that. And there's a reasonable argument not to make that. And you just need to make a decision on your own as to whether you want to do that or not. If you decide to not offer to interns and consider them to be seasonal employees, I would make sure that I write that down in my policy and be consistent with it, and show in your written memorandum to file or in your actual policy, we can add to it, that shows your reasoning for believing that it's appropriate. So if you decide to do that, we could add it, to your measurement method policy. And I don't mean to make it sound scary. I haven't ever heard of any problems with that for people who've used it, but I just have my own experience, and I don't know. Sometimes the interns end up being, if they're like college students and the only time that you can hire them is in the summer when they're off school, then that is a lot stronger argument than, oh, we just need an intern. It doesn't matter that they're not young. They could be any age and we hire them randomly throughout the year. That wouldn't really be a strong argument. It would just mean you've hired a short-term project employee. So do you see the nuances there? It's nuanced. Yes, I saw another. Yes. Okay, that's a great question. The question is, what is the intent of the rule? Is the rule intended to offer, to make sure that there are as many employees offered coverage as possible? I'm going to restate it, not exactly what you're saying, but, or is it, this sort of, what's the word, vague rule, and you just have to follow these guidelines? I'm not stating that very well. Let me restate that. The intent of these rules is to require a minimum standard. So if you want to be more generous, absolutely, there's no problem with that. It's a minimum standard so that you're at least capturing those who are full-time. If you want to, I think it's great that you want to offer to employees who have downtimes because the weather isn't great. I would do that as well if I were an employer. But we have some employers who don't want to or can't afford it or whatever. And so they're following the minimum rules. And so they would just want to stick with absolute minimum. But if you can, absolutely be more generous. So yes, next question. Right. The point is it also helps you prove that you offered or took them off in an appropriate manner. And if you are more generous, it reduces your risk. Correct. I agree. So it is. I mean, the whole reason we have you actually write, there's nothing in the rules that says you have to write down a written measurement method policy. But in what world would you not? Because you need to be able to provide proof. First of all, you need to be able to identify how to even structure this. And it's hard. I mean, if you ask me an eligibility question, I don't know the answer off the top of my head sometimes because I have to run the facts of this employee through your policy to see what the outcome is. It's different every time. So you want to be able to have proof if you get a penalty letter to say, hey, we took this one off. Yes, I know this person went to the exchange and got a subsidy, but we did offer them coverage and then we took them off for a legitimate reason. And this is why. Yes. The point is, and it's a good point, is while you can be more generous under the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and the employer mandate, but you also don't want to run afoul of your contract with your TPA or your insurer. And yes, you've got that other thing you've got to deal with. So, but typically you work that out, in your contract, and you let them know when you're making them eligible or not. And I haven't seen any situations where they've had a problem with being more generous, but obviously there are exceptions. So. Any other questions? Yes, in the back. The question is, are there any rules about sharing this eligibility policy with employees? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Just like your plan document and all the requirements you have to notify and provide documentation of eligibility of what's in the plan and who's eligible and all the rules. You also need to reference the eligibility and they need to understand what makes them eligible and what does not. The problem with putting it in your handbook or whatever is that this is a long policy. This is like a 12-page policy that is in detail because you need the details in order to figure out eligibility or not. And if a person requests that, you need to give that to them. We have some employers who reference the policy and say generally what it is without going into all the details, and then say if you would like the full policy, we'll give you the full policy. And that would be your written measurement method policy rather than a summary of it. Some employers want to give the full summary up front. I think that's great. I originally was saying you've got to put the whole thing in there, but it's not practical for some people and they don't have the room or the pages or whatever. I know that now so many things are electronic. It's not as big of a deal because we're not worrying about pages and how big the workbook is and how much we're paying for printing and that whole thing. But yeah, you're following general notice ERISA rules. So you need to make sure they understand. Anybody else? Yes. Did I cover reasonability for determining full-time status? You mean, how do I determine whether a person is reasonably expected to be full-time? We did cover it in the slides yeah. I try to keep it as high level as possible because this is a lot to take in. Thank you for coming. Next week is our last session and we'll dive in more and we'll actually walk through some examples as well. Some real life examples that I've been asked to show you how to actually apply the measurement methods to real life situations. Thank you.